Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session, this virtual session for the Louisiana Historical Association's annual meeting. Today you are attending the New Orleans Images, capturing and illustrating the Crescent City's African-American history. Before we get started, and I will introduce each presenter as they come forward for their papers. If you have a copy of the program, we're going to follow it just the way it's listed. But I have some housekeeping, as we say. The first part is that we are now, the Louisiana Historical Association is now accepting paper and session proposals for the 2021 annual meeting. You may visit the LHA website at lahistory.org for more information. That's lahistory.org for more information. And for this session, we ask that you please post your questions in chat and we will address them. It would be helpful if you post your question and when you do to state to whom you would like to address it, okay? And I think that that would work. So let's begin. We have three wonderful presentations today. And I want to say that this session came out of a conference last fall at the Louisiana Creole Research Association's conference in New Orleans. And so it gave us the idea to take this to an academic audience, even though the presenters made academic presentations, but of course for a lay audience. So they have worked through their presentations so that it would work for this academic audience and any other lay people in listening in. First, we have Dr. Mora Beauchamp-Byrd. And Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd is the, she is the visiting assistant professor of art at the University of Tampa, right? Great.
Yes.
And she is going to talk about one of New Orleans' finest, and that is Arthur P. Baidu. Her presentation on pictorialism then frames this photography in terms of its art and its relationship to a movement from paintings to photography. Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd, may begin. And each person has 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Baham, and thanks to my fellow panelists and to James and the Louisiana Historical Association for hosting us. I'm going to go to screen share now. Can you guys hear me pretty well?
Yes, yeah. You're loud and clear.
Okay. All right. All right. Good afternoon. I am, really excited to, have this discussion about Arthur Baidu's pictorialist photography in Creole New Orleans. Baidu is very much known as a photographer that he was born in 1882. He's known for a series of widely reproduced images of the renowned African-American educator and activist, Booker T. Washington. And these are images that date from about 1908 to 1915 until Washington's death. And he's also known for images of primarily Catholic Creole of color communities in early to mid 20th century New Orleans. And so this lecture, this paper is about a really underexplored area of scholarship. And that's looking at how Baidu has engaged with pictorialist aesthetics in both portraiture, and he also, did so in landscape photography as well. I will focus in particular on his distinctive portraits of New Orleans Creole colored communities, with an emphasis on images that were produced for Xavier University, the Sisters of the Holy Family. And this kind of pictorialism, that I'm speaking about, this romanticized, poetic kind of imagery that, this is a movement that emerges, in the late 19th century, around the 1890s, and continues up until about World War I, till the end of World War I. And it's really a movement to ensure that photography is seen as a fine art, to emphasize all of the sort of painterly things that could be done with photography that went beyond just documentation. In terms of the structure for this presentation, I'll start with a brief introduction to Baidu's work and his sort of biographical details, and explain this term that is used in so many ways, Creole, and particularly Creole of color, and but really to look at these traces of pictorialism, this global photographic movement, and how Baidu used soft focus and dramatic lighting and other kinds of manipulations of the composition to create a more painterly form of photography. Baidu is perhaps best known for the Booker T. Washington images. And as I looked at, his work, I started to really look at his work, quite extensively around 2008. All of these images of jazz musicians, vaudeville performers, Creole of color families, Mississippi and Louisiana landscapes. And I started to think about, what was it about Baidu's work that I was so drawn to, as an art historian, and as I looked at the images closely, I saw that there was this really interesting use of light, and I centered on this image of Dr. Rivers Frederick at Dillard's Flint Goodrich Hospital around 1932. And the way that the light seemed to give this almost spiritual sense of light in that space, and I thought about how it related to Baroque art, with chiaroscuro, how it related to other kinds of artists that, really, the light became, like a living thing in these works. And for me, my initial, work with Baidu came about in 2008 when I was asked to curate a show for the New Orleans African American Museum on the history of the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans. And this is an order of sisters that, were founded, in the mid-19th century and in New Orleans. And I centered on, here's the catalog, for the exhibition. Here's a portrait of, self-portrait of Baidu here. But I centered, when I started to write the essay for this catalog, I centered on this image. And it looks like a meticulously constructed wedding portrait of a woman called Marcelle Roussève. And Roussève was engaged in a process of personal transformation, but it wasn't a marriage in the conventional sense. Here she is swathed in this white fabric and lace, and she's gingerly placing a white gloved hand on a table that bears a sculpture of the crucifixion. Marcelle, through this process, would become known as Sister Teresa Vincent Roussève. And this is a kind of image called a Bride of Christ image, where Roussève consecrated herself to serving Christ and would become, bound to the vows of religious life. My interest in the work was around the care that I saw that Baidu took with this image. I was initially interested in it because it reminded me of a cousin of mine that had passed away, and images that I had of her. But there was something else. I was drawn to the composition, his, the placement of Sister Roussève's hand, this gloved hand that lightly taps the table, linking her to the sculpture of Christ there. And I also looked at the profusion of flowers and other foliage that animate the scene and add a pictorial complexity to the space behind her. And then the light that suffuses the scene, that I contrasted, I saw that was a contrast with the darkness beyond. And one of the things about living in Louisiana is that I remember growing up and hearing, if you were late for mass or something, you would hear someone say, hurry up, Baidu. And only later when I started to work on Baidu did I realize what it meant. Baidu had a history of being so meticulous that he would have you sitting there waiting for so long to take the photograph that it became, a part of, the general, a term that people would use for someone that was taking a long time. And it's this meticulousness that I was interested in its images, these sort of, compositionally complex images of the Sisters of the Holy Family. Here are a group of postulants on the stairwell at 717 Orleans at the Sisters' mother house, their initial mother house in the French Quarter. And there was just an emphasis to me on, a really dramatic presentation in these works. Now, Baidu was an artist who I felt a connection with, because of the way that he sort of took on sort of too many projects. 1903, he introduces himself to Booker T. Washington, who was the president of Tuskegee, and trying to get a kind of visibility for his work. And he was then invited by Washington to accompany him as his personal photographer, particularly on fundraising tours, because Baidu was from the South, and he also had a way of producing very dynamic images of the lectures that Washington was, conducting on his summer tours. And so, so these are images that were so important, and Washington knew the power of representation, visual representation. So he always had a number of photographers around him to document his speeches and his work as a scholar. And this is one thing that's important for, this whole discussion around representation. This idea of providing an image of African-American life that was very different from the stereotypical images that were seen in advertising, that was seen in film, that was seen in all kinds of visual culture. And so in assessing Baidu, I have to think about, that period of time, 1908 to 1915, and his work with Booker T. Washington, and how it's an extension of what he was doing, in New Orleans with these images of Creoles of color. Later in 2008, I began working at Xavier as the professor of art history and curator of the art collections there. And Dr. Francis, the university president, I know I don't have to say, but he wanted artwork all over campus. And one of the things that I thought would be important would be for the images that Baidu took at Xavier University, for there to be enlargements all over campus. So he was the portrait photographer for both the Sisters of the Holy Family, but also for Xavier University. And Xavier is the largest repository of Baidu's photographs. And so I had these text and image panels that I had all over campus, and I had enlargements all over campus. Baidu's portrait here of Mother Catherine Drexel, the founder of Xavier here. And what I wanted to say here is I've been talking about this term Creole and Creole of color, and I just wanted to give you a sense of what Baidu meant to that community. The late photographer Harold Baquet noted in an interview in 1991, and I quote, "We have an acknowledged photographic heritage here in New Orleans. There's Mr. Arthur Baidu. He took everyone's baby photograph. He documented the Creole community, New Orleans people of color. And it was a big thing to have a Baidu portrait. It meant that you were a person of means. You had contracted a professional. That photo would be proudly displayed on the mantelpiece." And when I talk about this idea of Creole of color, I'm referring to what the scholar Arte Anthony says, marks, this community. And I quote, "Cultural boundaries defined by familial and social networks, Catholicism, occupational and residential patterns, language, and a heritage of freedom." And she's referring to the history of the free people of color. And so here's this community that Baidu is documenting that is, giving a very distinctive kind of African-American presence that has to do with Louisiana history and has to do with the various specificities of race and mixed race tradition in terms of Louisiana history. And I realized that in thinking about pictorialism and this idea of a representation that was very different from other representations of African Americans, it was important to consider Baidu's work, with the Creole community. So that's a big part of my project, what it meant to document this community in particular, and these ideas of idealized images of beauty, which were very much a part of pictorialist aesthetic as well, but that I have to think about in terms of considering Baidu's work and Creole culture in New Orleans and in other areas of Louisiana. So I'm looking at images like the Autocrat Club, this Baidu image, where here's this 1935 visit with Duke Ellington and his orchestra that visited there, and how important this club is, which was founded in 1909, to the 7th Ward and Creole of color communities. So I'm looking at these kinds of images. I'm also in this project, thinking about Baidu and his, placing him in context. I'm thinking about his, the artists that were working at the same time as Baidu, and that were also photographing these communities. Photographers like Florestine Perrault Collins, who opened up a studio in the 1920s, and I look at, I've looked at images of her work. I'm continuing to assess what is it that makes Baidu's work so distinctive. There are, there's quite a difference in terms of what's in the picture. Baidu, usually had a backdrop and a vase and flowers and, other kinds of embellishments that sometimes spoke to a kind of Orientalist aesthetic. Also look at the work of Villard Patio, who was a protege of a student of Baidu. And Patio had a studio in Treme and produced well-known images of, Louis Armstrong and his family and other musicians, So there's a very distinct difference between what I saw, and I compared this portrait of Louis Armstrong with his sister and his mother, Mayanne, with this image that my fellow panelist is going to talk about extensively, this particular figure, Lucille Levi Hutton. And I thought about, this is one of my favorite images of Baidu, because I think about it in terms of Japanese made and what was happening at that time that focused on Chinese and Japanese aesthetics that was taking place in Europe and other places, and thinking about what Baidu may have come in contact with in these works, but really thinking about what made his work distinctive in this way. I also have been looking at images like these. This is an untitled Scenes from a Play, St. Mary's Academy, New Orleans, 1930s and 40s. And then on the right, Canoe on the Lake. Baidu did a number of studies along the Gulf Coast and also, around, Lake Pontchartrain, and where he really had this really dramatic experimentation with light and with really complex compositions. And Baidu was a self-taught artist, so I've been, spending a great deal of time trying to see, I knew that Baidu traveled, seeing what he accessed, during his, period of, the fundraising tours with Booker T. Washington, but also what, trying to assess the kinds of things that he was looking at. Was he looking at magazines that talked about pictorialism? These are the kinds of questions that I have. Now, I mentioned the way that pictorialism really focuses on this sort of hazy, soft light, and it gives you almost this impressionistic feel. And so on the left, you see the pictorialist Gertrude Cassabier's, image from 1909. And then here, you see the image of Dr. Rivers Frederick, So, these are very constructed images, and they lead your eye, certain ways. And here, our interest is here on what's happening, this idea of an almost sacred, kind of undertaking that's happening here with the surgery with Dr. Frederick. And so I'm looking at these images and just a bit more about pictorialism. A founding member of the Photosecessionists, which was the group of artists who promoted pictorialism, was the American photographer Clarence White. And White was known for these really delicate, soft lighting. He had been influenced by the Impressionist painters, looking at, works like, Monet, images from Monet and Renoir. He had also been influenced by the Japanese print, which is very much a part of, really the vocabulary of modernism that is happening with the artists that were working in Paris, looking at the silhouette from Japanese prints, looking at interesting uses of perspective, So there's a very dramatic kinds of sensibility that I think that Baidu taps into that is very much in line with pictorialist tradition. And I have to say here, one of my good friends, Erica James, the scholar Erica James, I was talking with her about Baidu a couple years ago, and she actually talked to me about, oh, this looks so pictorialist. And I remember thinking, I was just so caught up with the beauty of Baidu's images that it took me, when she said that, it all became clear, the kind of aesthetic that was happening. Another part.
About 2 minutes.
Oh, about 2 minutes, okay.
Yes.
All right, I got 3 images left.
Okay.
Okay. The linkage between Baidu and pictorialism is not it's not a surprising one. There's a link between an artist called Doris Ullman and the work that Baidu was producing. Doris Ullman, the American photographer seen here at the right, was known for a series of portraits of prominent intellectuals and writers and scholars and figures like Paul Robeson and Martha Graham and Yeats. And she was also known for images that looked at the less privileged population. She started to go into this tradition of looking at folk tradition, Appalachian white communities, craftsmen, musicians, African Americans in the South who were impoverished. And so what happens with her work, this is a very well-known image that's been written about over and over again in terms of images of African Americans in terms of photography. This is one of her most well-known images, called Baptism. And the image at the left is an image that was on the cover of the Getty's, there's a small book on Doris Ullman. Now, the book itself mentions that this is, and I quote, a sister of the order of the, of the Sisters of the Holy Family. And so she is not named by Ullman. Ullman goes to New Orleans as part of her Southern tours that she was doing when she was photographing many African-American communities throughout the South. And she photographs over a few days a large number of, images of the Sisters of the Holy Family members. And she doesn't name them. And that's one of the things that is distinctive about her work. Now, Ullman was very interested in this idea of a type, a type that would be a pioneer type. She'd want people to put on hats, that she wanted to have this sort of suffering image of impoverished people, of African Americans, that were facing challenges. And so there's this real focus on type. It's very different from the way that Baidu depicted these images. So in the 30s, both of them are photographing the Sisters of the Holy Family. And here's an image of Ullman's image of one of the sisters. Like I said, they're not named. And then here's Baidu's image, where he very carefully writes the name of Miss Marcel Roussave, and then her name after, this ceremony, the Sister Teresa Vincent Roussave, he writes, very carefully. And so part of my discussion of Baidu's work is centering on comparisons with other artists that were producing similar images at the time, and thinking about what was distinct about Baidu's images and what was so special about them as well. And thinking about that comparison, this idea of naming, I was so struck when thinking about, the way that both of these photographers function in the same time period, in terms of the same subject, that here's Baidu meticulously naming these individuals and identifying them. And then with the Ullman images, it almost felt like she saw their habits as costumes, like they were, here are a group of interesting types. And that was really the way that, she wrote about them, and there became a kind of obsession with them, but not so much to, not to the point where they were named in the works. So to conclude, in examining Baidu and, and comparing those works with Ullman's 1930s images of the Sisters of the Holy Family, there's a definite distinction with each artist's aims. Baidu is producing these treasured images, having these really intimate relationships with the families that he would document over the years. He would do their, baby photographs, as, as Baquet said, the weddings, the first communions, so he had this relationship with these families. Ullman, her interest was in seeking this sort of new and exotic characters from the South. She was very, very interested in things that would be enigmatically and distinctly Southern. And so that Baidu's portraits reveal a kind of everyday yet remarkable lives of New Orleans, middle class African Americans. And, he's rendering these images in picturesque detail, marked by pictorialist aesthetics. These are images that are suffused with a great measure of care, familiarity, a naming, along with the documentation. These were middle-class images. They were intimate, they were strategically beautiful, they were images of a distinct group of Southern African Americans that were, regrettably, rarely seen in mainstream early to mid 20th century American visual culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd. That was excellent. Excellent. I want to say that in introducing each of the presenters, their vitas are extensive in their work and in their own areas of expertise. Although I did not include that so that we could have time, and it'll kind of let us fudge a little bit of time so that each presenter can finish her presentation. But I just want you to know that each one has wonderful expertise verified in their own areas. So let's hear now from Dr. Jana Smith, who is Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Public Policy, also Program Coordinator for Health and Physical Education at Dillard University, who herself is developing some wonderful expertise. I do want to say, Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd, that in discussing Lucille Hutton, it depends on the community. Her name could be Levi or Levy.
I should ask Dr. Smith, how are you pronouncing it? Because I know you'll know better than me.
Okay, Dr. Smith, if you'll really release your mute and you may begin. Thank you, Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd.
It's pronounced Levy. Thank you, Dr. Baham. This research, the research that I've been conducting on Ms. Hutton has been ongoing, and I've presented at La Creole on last year, and continuing her research. Your feedback is welcome for any ideas that you have, and the images that you see and references are all from the collection of the Amistad at Tulane University. And so I'm going to discuss today with you about the pageantry festival of the Negro Music Festival of Orleans Parish Schools. And the importance of the jewel that it was in the community of New Orleans. So through the art of music and music education, Miss Lucille Levy Hutton mission was to uplift and equalize the lives of Negro children of Orleans Parish School and the community that supported it. She was an activist, teacher, and an architect of music educational curriculum of Orleans Parish Negro schools. It was designed to teach and produce teachers to give Negro children a quality formal liberal arts education. Having a formal liberal arts education, Lucille Hutton clearly understood the value of music education for her students and their communities. It would be the tool to equalize exposure and experiences of various social economic statuses of the Negro community. In producing the first Negro annual musical festival in 1948 at Booker T. Washington High School, the stage was set and designed for this movement to begin taking place. The annual festival annually brought 6,000 people from the Negro community to come and see boys and girls from 53 Negro public schools perform classical concert music and vocal, singing, dancing, drama, and gymnastics. The pageantry of the Negro Music Festival became the crown jewel of New Orleans public school arts program for both Negro and white schools. The annual Negro Music Festival, an outcome of Hutton's music arts program, with its well-crafted educational curriculum, leveled exposure to high art within the segment of New Orleans Negro communities. Of the second generation after slavery, on May 9th, 1897, Hutton was born to New Orleans to the parents of Robert Hutton and Miss Abby Levy Hutton of New Orleans. Designed and destined to become a change maker for equality in education, Ms. Hutton completed college preparatory courses in 1915 and normal teacher education studies in 1916 at Straight University. She took piano lessons first with Miss Ida Hall and later with Miss Elvira Mason Dungy in 1917. continuing lessons with a teacher named Miss Camille Nickerson, 1916 to 1928. Having never attended or been in a public school, Ms. Hutton took the Negro School Teachers Examination for an entire week and passed on her first attempt. Her first teaching position in 1916 was at McDonald 32 Elementary School in Algiers, on the west bank of the Mississippi River from the city. She transferred to Mora School in the city, later renamed Valina C. Jones Elementary School in 1917. In 1927 to 1928, she attended Mills College in Oakland, California, and in 1928, she transferred, enrolled into Oberlin College Conservatory of Music School. In 1923, she received a Bachelor's of Music degree. In the summer of 1936, she studied at the University of California at Berkeley and Columbia University in New York in 1938. This was followed by a postgraduate study in the music education at Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois, in which she earned a Master of Music degree in 1948. Her thesis drew on her work in the city and was titled An Evaluation of Music Training of Negro Teachers of the New Orleans Public Elementary Schools with recommendations for improvement. Her research of music education curriculum for Negro schools became the blueprint for music education curriculum to Negro children. It would be an enriching educational exposure to the community that supported the school. Transferring to Valina C. Jones, where a noted educator, Fannie C. Williams, served as principal. Hutton had the support of Miss Williams, being an art lover who wanted a music program at her school, a music education program at her school. New Orleans' history of being rich and diverse in its culture of music, food, religion, and students at Jones schools were rich and diverse in different ranges, tones of voices. The students who attended Jones schools were predominantly Creole Catholics. That meant they did not know spiritual songs. They sang with a high-pitched Caucasian sound. Our students who were Protestant knew spirituals and could harmonize freely by ear, their voices deeper tones than Catholic children. With a variety of wide ranges of voice tones, she taught, trained, and prepared all of her students to perform in their schools' operettas, festivals, their performances at the Peristyle for the all-girls choir, and also at the National Education Association Conference and the Roosevelt Hotel. She enjoyed teaching as well as it was not a challenge for her. She reported that the children wanted to learn and she wanted them to succeed. Her challenge involved adequate facilities and locations to teach her students. The conditions of the schools were not the best. The school had a fire and the school board replaced it with an inadequate building that was not conducive for learning. It was one floor building with a tin roof, and when it was hot and humid, it made conditions worse and unbearable. The building had 8 rooms side by side, one electric light that came from the ceiling and only hung in the principal's office. The restrooms that they had to walk through all of the rooms before entering the restrooms. The community petitioned the school board to build a second building. That board agreed, and a Category 4 hurricane came and destroyed it in 1915. They moved to a double house and made the best of a bad situation. She spoke about the support, the unwavering support of the community, and the community supported the school in every way they could. The guiding light of the community was the 7th Ward Civic League. The Civic League, made up of men in a community, petitioned the white school board to build a new school for Jones. The 7th Ward Civic League raised the money bought a lot and donated it to the school board to build a new school. These New Orleans community civic school engagements or social corporations in raising money and building a Negro school was common in Negro communities all across the United States. Valina C. Jones eventually received a newly built building. However, it still was not built to the quality equivalent standards of new schools built by and in the white communities. At Jones Normal School, Ms. Hutton taught music education, and the students that she taught were the top 10% of their schools from McDonald 35 and private high schools graduates. Hutton heavy load prompted her in 1936 to write E.W. Ely, Assistant Superintendent of Orleans Parish, requesting for a new position. Music supervisor in the colored schools it was. His response in a letter, February 13, 1936, essentially tabled the matter, noting, "Your application for a position as music supervisor in the colored schools has been received and filed for future reference. Should such a position be created, your claim will be considered." She continued undaunted to move forward with teaching. By 1938, Louisiana was the last state to close their normal school. Hutton relieved, not because she was losing her students, but because she was being relinquished of an extra duty as teaching responsibility. In conversations with white teachers, she found, or she discovered, that they received $40 of stipend as opposed to Ms. Hutton, who hadn't received any monies for stipends or extra teaching responsibilities. In 1939, Mr. Sontag, new assistant principal, requested for her and asked if she would consider being Ms. Conway assistant of vocal Negro schools. She accepted, and in 1939, Ms. Lucille Levy Hutton became the first Negro woman in New Orleans public schools to carve out and create a supervisory position in music education for Negro schools. She stated, "Word got out among principals that a Negro woman was hired to teach music in a Negro elementary school." She said her phone would not stop ringing from principals requesting her to teach at their schools. This was the beginning where theory and research became active in implementing the findings from her thesis. This evaluated the adequacy of the music training for Negro teachers in their public elementary schools, implemented in-service teaching training programs, and created and developed a new music curriculum for Orleans Parish Negro public schools. Ms. Hutton's observation of the current status of the Negro music education curriculum was that teachers were incapable of making full use of huge reservoirs of music ability within the pupils, and that they needed help in developing their own music potentialities. Her work included a survey of 310 Negro teachers in general education, music training, interest, and taste. She did not evaluate instrumental music because of the 26 elementary schools. There was one itinerary music teacher in the color schools. He taught in only three elementary schools. And the lessons, if you wanted to receive lessons, you had to pay for private lessons. Her findings proposed a music curriculum with activities involving singing, listening, rhythms, and creative expression, gaining knowledge of pitch pipe, playing the piano, reading the score, singing part, and listening for teachers who are deficient in pianistic skills, sight singing, voice and tone production, and training provided for every student on the high school level. Lastly, the music service training program provided for additional elementary and high school music teachers. Hutton reported in 1939 she worked at 23 schools, 21 elementary schools, and 2 high schools, McDonald 35 and L.B. Landry. In 62, she worked in 53 schools, 43 elementary, 6 junior high, 7 senior high schools. In kindergarten through 6th grade, she helped every teacher. In junior and high schools, she worked with teachers of vocal music. When she began her supervisory position, there were no certified vocal music teachers in high schools. At McDonald 35 High School, Mr. Belfield Spriggins taught music. He had a quartet, but was an art major. Landry High School had no music teachers at all. To improve the music education curriculum, proven to be a difficult task to accomplish. She was met with obstacles the size of boulders. She evaluated music textbooks, selected pianos, evaluated new Negro school teachers' applications, prepared monthly reports, helped monthly in-service meetings with department music teachers of large schools, standardized the teaching to synchronize similar programs. She demonstrated music skills with children for teachers. The teachers she trained substituted for her when she had in-service training in the beginning year. Her assessment and evaluation of music curriculum programs showed that teachers began to make measurable progress and students began improving in both vocal and instrumental music. The first annual music festival was held at Booker T. Washington High School on May 26, 1948 at 8:15 p.m. It seated 1,000 and it was sold out each year. The music ranged from Bach to Creole and American folk songs. She directed the high school choir of L.B. Landry, Booker T. Washington, and Joseph S. Clark. The dancers performed. They danced gypsy dance from Marriage of Nanette. Chorus performed Welcome to Havana with dancers performing Cuban dancing. The crowd, the superintendent, parents, all participated and were extremely proud of the advancement of her music curriculum program. 3 years sold out. The committee demanded from the superintendent that they would be moved to the municipal auditorium where the white schools where music festivals were held. It was granted and the stage was set. It would require detailed planning, greater organization, large volunteer committees of principals, teachers, students, parents, civic leaders, businessmen and women, all led under the leadership of Ms. Hutton. She prepared units for the program for variety. Rehearsals were held on the morning of the festival in the auditorium. School buses provided transportation for students to rehearsal on the night and on the performance of the program. Every teacher and student who had an assignment was in place for the performance. The women principals prepared reception in the foyer. Male teachers were ushers to seat the spectators. The chairman of the props had high school boys to move the units on and off the floor. The committee of men on the floor patrolled the corridors downstairs and kept up with 2,000 students participants. Each school had a committee of teachers in charge of their pupils who sat with them in assigned seats. They took them out to perform and brought them back. Ms. Hutton said the order was excellent and the students were all well behaved. Parents and the community at large filled every seat in the auditorium. Each participant student received 2 invitations. Principals received 4 and she received 4. It was always a demand to get an extra invitation, which no one wanted to give up. She had 4, elementary students in the 3rd and 4th grade performed with the dance theme to Indians. They came out to the drums, to the beat drums of tom-toms. They had never seen such little children on stage in a big arena to perform so well. When they went off stage, a 10-year-old boy lifted up the girl and laid her across his hands and had one knee bent. The audience went, wow, it was a perfect dance. Some teachers had dance schools and some teachers taught dance to their classroom students. It was not outside professionals to teach dance to our students. Every performance was performed by the students. There were no adult performers. It was a partner, if it was a partner dance, every girl there had a boy participant. Finding boys to participate proven difficult for white schools, music festivals, where it was poorly attended by parents and community. Girls had to dress as performers and adults had to fill in. Dr. Redmond, new superintendent, and Mr. Peterson, who attended the festival, were extremely impressed with the Negro Schools Festival's organization, selection of music, and dance professionalism, and high level of skill and talent among students' performance. The white staff of the auditorium said how much they enjoyed the Negro Festival and agreed that the Negro Festival was better than the White Festival every year. Each year they had a theme. 1950, commemoration of John McDonnell. 54, 50th anniversary of Power Flight of the Wright brothers. 53, anniversary of Louisiana Purchase. 55, Music in America. And 62, the Happy Wandering Dance from all over the world. With the commitment of teachers, principals, and social cooperation of the community, every year the Negro community gathered in an environment that leveled the community field of classism and social economic status. Parents from
2 minutes.
Oh,
Okay, you got it.
Okay. So the Negro Music Festival gave the community a safe environment and enjoyed the experience, dance, drama, gymnastic, classical instrument, and vocal music. Every year, this community entered the municipal auditorium and it was sold out. The last year of the festival was in 1962, where this segregation came in and no longer it was funded. And so therefore it was it still carried on, and it's still carrying on today through me and through others of you who are watching today who participated in festivals at your schools in New Orleans. So lastly, I have to share with you some images of the festival that you can have an idea of what I just read to you. Yes. Please share. Yes. Okay. The first image that you see is the courtesy, all of these images are courtesy of the Amistad Research Center at Tulane University. And as you can see, the top of the audience is with 6,000 attendants. Below you will see all of the students, the student participants who participated in the music festival annually. The second image you'll see in the center is Miss Hutton. And as you can see to your right is the red double door building that you see with her students. And to the left is the newly built school, which is still standing today on Mora Street. The next image you see is the all-girls choir that performed at the NEA conference, and you'll see Miss Levy here to your right at the end. And again, as I stated, this choir sang throughout the city and was well known for its talented singers. Below, you see in the center of the choir of students from multiple high schools of 53 high schools. Center here, you see Miss Lucille Hutton, who is the conductor of the choir. Another image of the municipal auditorium, as you see at the end of the auditorium where everyone gathered for a picture. But again, you just have to keep in mind how orderly and this was orchestrated, and the people who were committed into being volunteers to make sure that the community came together on this day for this freedom of celebration of music. And the last image that you see is a Baidu picture, and it is of Miss Hutton sitting for a portrait. And as you stated, Ms. Mora, the lighting that you see with Ms. Hutton and the imagery and that it captured, and how you see the placement of her hand and the shadows that are in the light, and how it's placed, her shadows in the light of this image. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I hope that you can see how these presentations are connected so well. Next, so that we'll have ample time, we'll hear from Ms. Lynette Dolliole Johnson, who also does wonderful work in preservation, has developed expertise in that area. She has worked and made presentations at the Louisiana Creole Research Association as well. And she is a graduate student at Tulane University in preservation, right, Ms. Johnson? And so she has developed already quite a name for herself in this field. You may begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you to the Louisiana Historical Association and to my fellow panelists. My presentation looks at New Orleans architecture in family history and images. Streetscapes in New Orleans are full of charm and character, in large part due to the handcrafted ornateness or the simple beauty or sometimes the whimsy or the offbeat rhythm of the city's architecture. Local vernacular architecture in particular helps define the vibe and personality of a neighborhood, as well as reveal much about the characters who built and lived in the structures. Old dwellings, especially whether standing or accessible only in images, can be valuable because they give us clues that can offer insights into past worlds. I'm a student in Tulane School of Architecture, pursuing a master's degree in preservation studies, as Eva mentioned. I'm also a family researcher and a member of La Creole, and I've worked extensively with images in my professional career as a newspaper journalist and art director. So I'm pulling together all of these experiences to explore how one might fill in gaps of knowledge pertaining to family history by turning some attention to architecture. Those are some of the La Creole conference programs. At Tulane, my History of American Architecture professor began that course by asking, what is architecture? And we surmise that it's simply buildings and other physical structures, and it's also the art or practice of designing and constructing buildings. The buildings need not have been professionally designed or be recognized as historically or stylistically significant. Architecture, as might be helpful in family history research, simply needs to be a building constructed or used by people in the family. In pursuing information about family history, it's common to run into brick walls due to an absence of recorded information and surviving documents. This is especially true when researching the families of African Americans whose lives in general tended to not be well documented in the first place. So today I'm examining how architecture and images depicting it can play a large role in illuminating a family's history. I'll do that by looking at a case study, the monumental role architecture has played in gaining insights about the New Orleans Afro-Creole family, my family, the Dolios. The importance of images of buildings cannot be overstated in understanding and relating the history of the Dolios. They were builders and craftsmen who passed on the trade from one generation to the next, which makes this focus on architecture logical. Essentially, they were among those who had a hand in shaping the look and feel of the early New Orleans streetscape. But perhaps it's just as interesting to view all the ways that dwellings played a role in influencing and shaping the values, perspectives, and habits of the Dolio family. I'll look at three aspects of family life for which architecture can help us tell their story: work, interpersonal relationships, and community. First, legacy of building, the work part. Architecture can be an especially useful gateway to information when the family members you want to learn about are responsible for creating buildings. Some researchers are fortunate in that many Creole families of color, both men and women, were artisans and builders, land speculators, real estate developers. And so we have those buildings or images of those buildings or historical accounts of those buildings, as well as property transaction documents to help us discover information about those people's activities. When piecing together a family portrait from the distant past, sometimes a building or a photograph of a building is all you have to go on. My ancestral cousin, Jean Vidolio, born in New Orleans in 1779, was an architect builder who is referenced at least on one historic house marker in New Orleans. Though Jean-Louis's father, Louis, and his brothers, Joseph and Pierre, and later his wife and mother-in-law, were all active in real estate, it was Jean-Louis who was the most prolific Dolio builder in the antebellum period. But he's something of a mystery. He left no diary. There are no journals that quote him directly. He lived during an age, the early and mid 19th century, when photography was a young but popular art form, but no known portraits of him exist. If we were to capture and illustrate the life of Jean Vidolio, an accomplished free man of color who was part of the Louisiana militia, he was part of the group who signed a petition to President Lincoln agitating for voting rights. He did accomplish some things in his life, but an illustration of his life would look something like this: a series of buildings. Images of his architectural contributions constitute the most profound material evidence available for getting to know Jean-Louis. So what can we learn about Jean-Louis through an examination of architecture? One of my favorite New Orleans legends involves the 19th century aristocrat Bernard Dumarini, who developed a lot of downtown New Orleans, the Marigny section, as well as some parts of the North Shore. And the house at 1436 Bourbon Street in Faubourg Marigny. When the property received a major landscaping overhaul in 1996, the Times-Picayune reported that surrounding the history-packed house were legends about Bernard Dumarini and Jean Lafitte frequently gambling there. The unusual plastered brick Creole Cottage, situated where Pauger Street angles into Bourbon, was built in 1820 by Jean Vidolio. While it's unlikely that there was a social connection between Bernard, a white aristocrat, and Jean-Louis, a free man of color, they were contemporaries operating in real estate in a relatively small world and with connections to this unusual property. It turns out that Jean-Louis bought the lot from his mother-in-law, who had bought it from Dumarini in 1807. The Bourbon Street house helps illuminate the work and talent of Jean Vidolio as a strong contributor to the local building crafts. The house is called by architectural historians his masterpiece, and Jean-Louis is referred to as being among the most outstanding of the tradesmen who may have contributed to the refinement of the 4-bay hip-roof cottage. Jean-Louis and his brother Joseph distinguished themselves designing and building cottages in the early 1800s that seemed to portray each one's personal flair. Jean-Louis applied creative solutions to challenges presented by odd-shaped lots like the one on Bourbon. And many cottages in the Creole faubourgs are attributable to him because they reflect his style and tendencies. The family overall built many houses in the French Quarter and Treme. They were in a position where they could help rebuild the French Quarter after the Great Fires of 1788 and 1794. In the antebellum period, the Dollios built more than a dozen properties and owned at least 36. So what does their work and the products of their work, the buildings, say about them? They were apparently creative problem solvers who paid great attention to detail. What do their actions say about them? Perhaps we can surmise that they were enterprising risk takers who seemed to take advantage of what was available to them. They were entrepreneurial, industrious perhaps, and opportunistic. By the 1930s, the house at 1436 Bourbon Street had fallen on hard times. Jean-Louis had passed away in 1861, but it's fascinating for me to see his house moving forward in time and serving others. Several houses in the French Quarter itself, especially in the 900 block of St. Philip Street, were once Vidolio properties. The Creole Cottage at 933 St. Philip, built in 1805, is the first or among the first attributed to Jean-Louis. He lived there until his first wife died in 1820. It's a typical brick structure, typical for that time, covered in stucco to protect the soft, early 19th century brick. The flared eaves are a part of Jean-Louis' style. The properties on either side, too, were at one time owned by his father, and Jean-Louis is thought to have built those houses as well. When people walk past these centuries-old houses in the French Quarter, they probably don't think about people of color, Afro-Creoles, as having designed, built, owned, and lived in many of them. That the earliest city of New Orleans, the Vauquerès, was built in large part by people of color surprises some. There's not much of a trace of Black property owners in today's French Quarter, but that's another whole story. For any family with an architectural legacy, and in New Orleans, this applies to many African-American families, procuring and maintaining images of relevant buildings is of paramount importance in preserving the past, because one cannot take for granted that the buildings will always stand. It's important to maintain the historical record for the families and for posterity as well. We move on to the architecture of behavior. So let's interrupt this Dolliole family case study with a nod to Deacon John Moore, the New Orleans music legend. When local radio host Gwen Tompkins interviewed Deacon John back in 2012 for her public radio show, Music Inside Out, Moore kept bringing the conversation back to the house he grew up in. And I refer to Deacon John because his story illustrates an important point about the family dynamic as impacted by its dwelling. In Deacon John's family, 13, count them, 13 people lived in half of a shotgun double on North 20th Street in the 8th Ward. For the Moores, there was an inherent lack of privacy built into that, but there was also a forced but ultimately beneficial intimacy and spirit of sharing. Deacon John doesn't downplay hard times or trouble, but he describes a happy childhood in a house filled with music and laughter. He also describes the house as if it was a character in his story, as an influential force on the family's dynamic. We can look at a photograph of the house and see the close quarters and imagine the family interactions. It's especially striking when thinking about how we tend to live today with isolated private rooms and large open common areas. In Jean-Louis' day, the Creole Cottage was the predominant house type occupied by family members. This house type, with its relatively small footprint and adjoining rooms with no hallways, meant that the family lived and interacted much like the Moores in their half of a shotgun double. One room connected to the other, and passage through the 4 or 6 room house diminished personal privacy. The shotgun house, the dominant form the Dollios built and lived in during the late 19th and early 20th century, created a similar dynamic. Family stories about life during that time, supported by photographic evidence of the houses, also says a lot about the values, perspective, and economic conditions of the era. One story I heard over and over again in my childhood was how big and full of life was the family house at 2010 Palger Street. The family built and lived in many houses on Parker Street between North Claiborne and St. Claude Avenues, but one house stood out in family lore. They cheekily called it the Big House, the place where my great-grandmother, Virginia Dolliole, lived, along with several other relatives. My mother told stories about a long house with room after room where she and her cousins would pile into a handful of beds for extended sleepovers. It was Grand Central Station for the family, a place where celebrations, suppers, wakes, lots of entertaining took place. I should note that Virginia had 11 children herself. When I look at photographs now of the Big House, I wonder, what did it mean to call this narrow little house big? It probably meant that compared to other homes, this one perhaps was bigger and grander. It means that the family lifestyle was modest at best, but it also signifies that they could make the best of what they had and appreciate what they had and see more in what they had than perhaps what was actually there. It points to a certain amount of appreciation and optimism. Another telling story about architecture and the family dynamic involved my great-grandfather, Joseph Vidolio. He liked to cook, and he was said to be darn good at it. He made many of his own meals despite living in a house dominated by women, but he resented the women of the house interfering with his meal preparation. And so because he was a master builder, he solved the problem architecturally by constructing a second kitchen just for him at the 2010 Parker Street house. And looking at photos of that house and hearing stories about all the humanity he piled into it at one time, one might think that an extra bedroom rather than an extra kitchen would have been more advantageous. But the back of the house sported 2 kitchens, an architectural oddity created due to an interesting family dynamic. Of family homes up and down Parker Street and beyond, I think about backyard get-togethers, the use of side entrances and alleys during family parties as ways that the material form of the buildings helped shape the activities that took place there. People congregated in kitchens, which back in the day, and still happens today quite a bit, was the source of a lot of the house's warmth. And so gatherings were intimate, boisterous, sweaty, fun. For one last family house story, I'll bring in another special guest, Jude Saraparoo. Jude grew up in Lucille, Louisiana near Edgard. His family also lives in New Orleans. Like Deacon John's family, the Saraparoo's house was full to the brim with people. His mom, dad, multiple siblings, extended family. The house itself, as we can see in the photographs, indicated that the Saraparoos at the time they bought the house were a family of modest but decisively middle-class means. Features of the house, the wraparound mantle, the large number of panes of glass in the windows, the surrounding acreage, all indicate a higher economic status than was typical of a lot of Creole families of color at the time. I did a short documentary film about Jude some years ago in which he related that while he was mostly a well-behaved young man, his family house in Lucy was conducive to at least one bad bit of behavior. The house was raised, sitting high on piers, providing a generous amount of crawl space. Jude showed me how he took advantage of that built-in feature, ducking underneath the house to hide from his parents and smoke cigarettes in his early youth. He allowed me to immortalize that area by photographing and therefore preserving the memory of that site of his illicit youthful escapades. And then finally, community. The last area I'm looking at is how architecture and images of architecture help to reveal and illuminate, hopefully, how housing design has connected New Orleans families to their communities, and how sometimes that larger world has impacted families and family decisions about living arrangements and space. And this shows the fairly infamous North Claiborne Avenue Expressway, and that expressway itself alone had a lot to do with patterns of living in the downtown areas, and that it scattered a lot of families after it was built. But that too is a whole other story. Changes in the city over time meant changes in living patterns. As I just said, looking at this series of maps, we can see that the Vidolio family started out building and living in the Beau Carré. As time went on and the city grew, opportunities developed to spread out to newer areas, and the Vidolios capitalized on that, So the latter part of the 19th century, they spread out a bit into the Marigny area, Tremé a little bit more. And eventually they sold all of their French Quarter properties and began building more modern house types in Faubourg Marigny and Tremé. Those house types, as I've noted in the previous section, accommodated certain behaviors, such as the ability to add an extra kitchen. Common features of New Orleans houses, more so in older neighborhoods like Marigny and Tremé, are narrow alleyways and close proximity to adjacent houses, close proximity to the street, walkability, and galleries and front porches that encourage and facilitate communing with neighbors and passersby. Images support the notion that these physical features facilitated certain types of social behavior. This image represents a phenomenon known colloquially as door popping, the partially obscured or full-bodied positioning at the open front door in order to observe what's going on in the neighborhood. These are my parents. Because houses were so close and front doors open right onto the sidewalk, door popping meant that people knew one another's business. Related to door popping is stoop sitting, but this activity had a positive side, as did door popping, in that it was a type of early neighborhood watch. People looked out for one another, so there was some sense of protection and security accompanying this practice, in addition to being able to facilitating easy interaction with neighbors, which was important in building community. Stoop sitting is apparently hereditary. That's my mom when she was a teenager, and that's me later having a go at it. In looking at this photo, I'm struck by the elegance of the simple shotgun house interior. This is the front room of that door popping house. My parents were on their way to a carnival ball. But entertaining and socializing in one another's houses, which happened often in small rooms like this one and happened a lot in this room, didn't feel so confined, in part because of the generously high ceilings that were decorated with ornate medallions and light fixtures. Mantelpieces with space heaters beneath them, burning small flames, also helped create a warm, intimate space. Many Afro-Creole families long lived in the old neighborhoods eventually did get lured by the pull of modernization and moved from downtown to newer neighborhoods like Gentilly, Pontchartrain Park, and New Orleans East, where tract homes offered space to spread out, as well as front and backyards. In the new neighborhoods with houses set back from the street with long pathways to front entrances, door popping was not as effective. This was actually not a trivial thing, as it did impact somewhat the sense of community in these newer neighborhoods. And I conclude by reflecting that for anyone curious about their own or another family's history, it's possible to look to architecture to help broaden an understanding of the past. The powerful influence of the built space should be factored in for its often unrecognized contribution to family life. It can be illuminating to see how the people who inhabited these buildings found themselves, their values, perspectives, habits, actions, shaped and influenced by aspects of their built environment.
Thank you so much. I hope that everyone who is sharing with us now will post any questions that you might have. I just will make a few comments that what connects these papers and presentations is the idea of design as history and how it does tell the story of the people. And so I heard this phrase, I'd like to claim it for myself, but it is not mine. I heard it somewhere of a person who was talking about telling the stories of people of African descent, or African Americans. It says that we must claim the character of our content. The character of our content to tell the story of people of African descent or African Americans, but I think that would apply to almost any group, to talk about them and the ways they see themselves. And I think that starting with Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd's paper, we saw that in the idea of pictorialism, that here it was a fine art. Or I don't know, Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd, if I should say it is a fine art. And that what Baidu did, and of course, including other New Orleanians who were photographers like Harold Baquet, Florestine Perrault Collins, and Dillard Padio, all of whom had these images to depict the people in themselves, how they see themselves, and also in a romantic way, how they would like to see themselves. And all three of the papers talked about Afro-New Orleans, if you will, New Orleanians, who then can, oftentimes we don't hear this kind of discussion. We hear them in their plight. And I think that one of the things that highlighted this was the differences that Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd showed between Ullman's photography as well as and Baidu's and others, is that here they constructed, she said, an image, they each constructed images, but in Ullman's way, she constructed an image of the suffering people, the suffering people of Appalachia, the suffering people among, I mean, even if you look at Baidu's images of the Sisters of Holy Family, and you look at her images make them look awfully sad. And when you show those, in contrast, Baidu's images see a hopeful, uplifted group of people in other ways. And when we moved to Dr. Lucille Levy Hutton, she too designed. She, according to what Dr. Jana Smith says here, that Lucille Levy Hutton designed a community through the arts, through the fine arts. She brought together all segments of the Black community. I'm telling you, just listening to how many schools she had to serve by herself, 50 some schools at some time. You're wondering, I'm left wondering, how the heck did she survive her day? But even post-Civil War and immediately after the war, or even during the war, as the American Missionary Association sent teachers, particularly Black teachers, on the heels of the Union's victories, to start educating these former enslaved people. We had teachers, I think Peake was one of them out in Hampton, who died literally from having to work such long hours because they had this mission, this charge. So I would suggest to you that what Lucille Levy Hutton did was to design this music system to help to design the community itself across cultural lines, so that you see in the pageantry, in this huge pageantry. I think that at one point in the paper you cite, there were 6,000 seats in that auditorium, and always filled to the capacity. So it showed about this character of the content of the people, right? That took parents' commitment, that took the community at large, that took the builders, people who were building things, who were constructing these sets, that took the seamstresses. I'm not ever sure, it's the modeste, I think is the name for them. It took all these people, not just the school. The parents did not turn their children to the school according to what you have said here, but rather they were intricately involved in it. I think it was important too in your paper, Dr. Smith, that you gave a recitation of all of her credentials. Mm-hmm. Because to me, it highlights also the tragedy of a society that would take someone with such great credentials and place them as second class.
Yes.
And hopefully we have moved on from that in many ways. And we know there's such a long way to go, but we want to be hopeful, and we can see some changes. And then again, with Ms. Johnson's paper, we see again this whole theme of design, of the people, of talking about the people. Again, in this phrase, character, the character of their content. And what a remarkable and wonderful way to use your own research. And I know Lynette for a few years that she has been diligently doing this work and using her family as a case study. I don't think that anybody who's listening would go through the French Quarter again without looking for those addresses and looking for those homes. And I know that this segment is being recorded, so if you miss some of the addresses, you'll have to figure out how to listen to the recording. But telling this story of Jean-Louis Vidolio, a free man of color, born in the late 1700s, and the family as it moved on an entire century, and then into the next century. So we have here almost 300 years, or rather, let's put it more realistically, over 200 and some years of family represented here with Miss Johnson, looking at how architecture tells our stories. And so that you could see that in there, we can talk about the shotgun houses, but what she did was to put this into perspective of how people lived in those houses. And certainly, I think many of you have heard over and over, and I'll end it with this, that when people say that they go back to a home that when they were children, a home that was considered the big house, and the house was so small. Because you were so small at the time. But what she did was to define for us this historical perspective of anybody who goes back home. And in understanding that big house didn't mean the size of the house. It was the bigness of the people in it and the like. So for all three of you, I see that we have in looking at your papers prior to and listening to these presentations, I see the common thread is that using design to explain the history of a people. Looking at it all three ways as fine art and how wonderful we can use that to tell our stories. And that would be not only the stories of African Americans, but of anybody in any part of the world. So I want to thank all three of you. I have looked at the chat. I don't see any questions, but I have one person who said to you, I enjoyed all three topics. As a native of New Orleans, it was so interesting to learn about our history of our community. Great knowledge from the instructors. Someone else says, such an excellent presentation. Kudos to you all. And thanks, Henry, for saying thank you all. Outstanding presentations. I'm biased because I got to read all of them ahead of time. I think they were all outstanding as well. But according to James Wilson, I have to give you another announcement, and that is that we certainly want to encourage this wonderful kind of research on Louisiana history. Join the Louisiana History Association, but also that we are accepting papers for the next annual meeting, which will be in the spring of 2020. And you may go to lahistory.org to make that presentation. I think we have about a minute and we'll be right on time. Thank you all, wonderful scholars, wonderful scholarship, and it's just been great. So if there's anything that you want to say in 5 seconds for each of you, you could say it. We're getting thank you all so much from Miss Renee Simeon. I really enjoyed this. From Dr. Ashraf Ishmael, great job, everyone. Thank you. So sounds like you're a hit. and of scholarship. Go ahead, Dr.
I just
Smith.
would like to say one thing is that when you are observing at Jazz Fest and you hear these gospel choirs from the high schools, or at Mardi Gras and you see the bands marching and what we're known for, all of that, it's a legacy of Lucille Levy Hutton, who designed and architected a music education program. She's not given the credit, but these are very important parts of our culture and what makes people want to come to New Orleans for Mardi Gras, to see the bands, to Jazz Fest, hear the choirs at Jazz Fest. It was designed by her.
Wonderful. Closing, anything closing, Ms. Johnson or Dr. Beauchamp-Byrd? Anything that you'd like to share in closing?
I just want to thank you again for, putting together this panel. I haven't been home in a minute, and I'm happy to hear about home and see home. And, so it was really, I enjoyed today a lot. And thank you.
I saw you paying special attention to all those images of the pageant and
Yes.
of all of those architectural images that Ms. Johnson was showing. I was looking at
I had to get real close to the screen.
I know, I saw you moving.
Yeah, we were bringing home to you.
Yes, I need it. I wish you could bring me some food.
Oh, on that.
We'll have to go over to Tampa and turn it out, New Orleans style. Ms. Johnson, would you have any closing?
I'm just grateful to you and the association for staging this. I know it's been, a little bit of a trick, but I think it's turning out very well. So thank you.
Very good. We had another couple from Giselle says thank you, and from Madras Farb, who says I really enjoyed Dr. Byrd's presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And if there are students, or I do know some of these might be students, but if you're listening, oftentimes I'll say in closing, students will say, is there more to our story, especially first and second year students, than slavery or being enslaved? Well, you heard a lot of it today, and there's a lot more, and there are a lot of wonderful scholars, especially doing Louisiana history, telling all aspects of our history. So stay tuned, it's wonderful. I'm going to turn this back over to our host, and that's James.